So thanks again for joining us, everybody. I'm Doug Mitchell. I have the distinct privilege of being the executive director of the Glacier National Park Conservancy, and this is our 11th and final Glacier Book Club event of the year. Many of you have been with us for each and every one of them. I hope you all have gotten a little note from me in the mail recently with a bookmark and next year's schedule on it. Hope you'll be able to join us. Tonight we have a very special opportunity. I like to think of myself as a lifetime learner, and I was telling our guests tonight, Germaine White and Thompson Smith, that when I was at San Pedro Elementary School, my highlight of my career at San Pedro was being the milk monitor on Hot Dog Day, by the way. We learned about the Lewis and Clark expedition in terms of the discovery of the American West, right? And took that to the bank as being, what the Lewis and Clark expedition was about. Obviously, this book helps us open our eyes to a new way of thinking about the landscape and the people who have inhabited the landscape for generation and generation and hundreds of generations prior to Lewis and Clark being here. And this book is presented to us by the Sélish-Ql Culture Committee and the elders, and the elders specifically, it's the Elders Cultural Advisory Council of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And we couldn't have all of those people tonight, but we have a couple of people who are really critical to the making possible of this book being in your hands and being able to help us think differently tonight. And those two people are Thompson Smith and Germaine White. I have the privilege of having Germaine as one of our board members. She's one of my bosses here at the Glacier National Park Conservancy, and she has spent 35 years working for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes, National Park Service, Salish and Kootenai College, really with the focus on bringing resource management decisions, cultural and conservation discussions, how those collide with economic issues, helping teach and learn about how we deal with those as a society. So Germaine, thank you for being part of the Conservancy and for being here tonight. And Thompson Smith, who is the coordinator of history and ethnogeography projects for the Culture Committee, had rolled up his sleeves and been involved in development of a lot of this history. So Thompson, thank you for spending time out of your holiday evening as well to be with us tonight. Let's start, if we could, and maybe Germaine, you want to start this off. Kind of how did this whole project come about that ended up in this book?
Thanks, Doug, and I'm delighted to be here tonight. Thank you for your warm welcome, and gosh, I'm delighted to meet all of you here. So in preparation for the Bicentennial event, the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial event in 2005, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes decided that we would tell our story and that we would tell a more even and honest and balanced story about our interactions with Lewis and Clark. There were many scholars that had stepped forward and brought Lewis and Clark information to the table. They were, everything that had been known about Lewis and Clark, the journals, the maps had all been produced, but the tribes had not been invited. So our tribal council asked if I would be the point person for the tribes. And that was kind of what launched my engagement with Lewis and Clark activities, events.
And you mentioned when we were chatting, as we were doing our tech check, the circle of tribal advisors.
Yes.
Talk to us a little about how that played in here.
There was a Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commission. There were commissioners that were appointed. They were government appointees that that began examining all of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial information in preparation for bicentennial events and activities. What they realized was that they were only telling one side of the story, and there needed to be a more honest and balanced telling of the story. So they invited a number of tribal people to become engaged in a more formal process. And that was, there was Bobby Connor from Tomastilit Cultural Institute, Umatilla Tribes, Amy Mossett from Mandan Hidatsa, 3 affiliated tribes, myself. There were a number of Nez Perce. There were a number of people that were invited to sit on what was called a circle of tribal advisors, and we were there to really help provide that, as I said, honest and balanced telling of the story.
That's astonishing. And Thompson, then you kind of got to pick up the mantle here a little bit and kind of help bring some of those disparate voices and unify them. Talk to us a little bit about how that work happens within the cultural committee and how it came to be this book.
Sure. Well, thank you, Doug, and just thank you for including me in this discussion. Listening to Germaine, I'm reminded of her articulateness and her mastery of this kind of theme. And you really don't need to hear from me. You've got the book, you've got Germaine, you're good. But I'll chip in. I mean, I work for the culture committee, so the culture committee was a part of the overall effort that Germaine kind of outlined there of kind of a tribal engagement with the bicentennial, an effort to put forward voices and understandings, framings of this story that really were missing from most of what was then flooding the public square and the schools and everything else, TV and movies. And so the culture committee was a part of the overall response that Germaine helped coordinate and lead and direct so ably. And I was just one part of the culture committee. And so whatever we're producing as a culture committee goes through a very similar process with each book or pamphlet or interpretive sign or museum exhibit or whatever it is. And that is, we begin by gathering what's called the Elders Cultural Advisory Council. So this is really outlined pretty well in the introduction, I think, which I assume everybody on this thing has read. It's a pretty good description of the process of production, especially when combined with the list of contributors in the back. And as is outlined there, the heart and soul of everything the culture committee does, and which is a part of this book, are the recordings, almost all of them in the Salish language, that were done with elders. It was how the culture committee began back in the mid-70s. And out of kind of unintentionally, out of that simple beginning, out of just following the lead of the elders, the culture committee formed one of the finest, most extensive archives of recorded oral history of any tribal nation that I know of. And so the Elders Cultural Advisory Council then has continued as an organized body. So there's a small staff of a culture committee, of which I am one person. And then there's an Elders Cultural Advisory Council of traditionally knowledgeable men and women, Salish and Pend Oreille or Kalispel. And we gather them and ask them, what message do they want? Do they want to do this project? And if so, what message do they want? So we really begin from the outset with that. We go through the gathering of the information from their materials. And the unique thing about the culture committee is the way it is able to bring into dialogue the recorded oral traditions with extensive, painstaking scouring of the archives across the country and even across the world. All kinds of archival records and maps and documents. And so we bring those things into conversation with one another in a way that I don't think any other institution can. We draft things, we bring it to the elders, we work through them painstakingly line by line to make sure that what we're giving voice to is the elders' the elders' voices. Really, that's our job, is to really reestablish the elders as the primary authorities on tribal history and culture. And I'll leave it there.
It's a very powerful thing to think about, I think, when we think about the deliberation that has gone into this work and the bringing together of so many voices, and then the creation and agreement on a unanimous, if you will, kind of approach to this. It's in and of itself, that's unique. So this is going to be a great evening. Thank you again for being with us. And I know that Thompson, you have a presentation. As always, I couldn't do this without my coworkers, Grace Kinsler and Jill Bridgman are with us. Please use the chat feature, or you can also just unmute yourself and launch. Tom and Germaine are really interested in having a discussion. I'm king of the dumb question when it comes to this kind of stuff, and there aren't any. These are two really nice human beings, and this is an opportunity for all of us to learn together. And so if there's a question you've always wanted to know, this is a great safe space to have it, and be open to hearing things that might challenge you as well. With that, Tom, if you want to share your screen and
Sure.
walk us through your presentation, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Germaine, does that sound good? Should I go ahead and
Una,
start? Okay.
yes.
She told me yes. Okay. Can everybody see that?
We got it.
Okay. There we go. So go ahead, Germaine.
As Tom said, I work for the Culture Committee also for about a decade, and then in Cultural Resources for about another half dozen years or so. And we had the great privilege and opportunity to meet with elders who were incredible culture bearers. And it was out of our desire to share their voice and their experience and their history and their cultural knowledge that this book was really born. Tom, what else would you say about this particular publication?
Well, I think we've given a good introduction to kind of how it came about and how we pursued it. And I guess we should add that we were fortunate enough to work with a press, the University of Nebraska Press, that was really interested in the elders' perspective and in basically just helping the tribes tell their own story.
Yes, and at that time, the press, University of Nebraska Press, had produced the journals and had produced huge atlases of the map. And they knew that side of the story, that Lewis and Clark's telling of their adventure, their journey, their expedition, all of that was known and had been shared. The piece of the story was that they were arriving in a land that was known and loved, and there were many, many indigenous people that they encountered, and that story had not been told. So they were very welcoming. University of Nebraska Press was very welcoming to have that countervailing story.
Yeah. And beyond that, I believe they saw the unique nature of this project. And so they actually assembled their entire team and came up to Montana several times to meet with the elders, to make sure the elders themselves were comfortable with the team and that they understood clearly from the elders what they wanted. So couldn't have been better. So Germaine, I'll go ahead to the next one.
Great.
This
is one of my favorite slides, Tom. The next,
yeah.
Yes, it is. This is Charlie M. Russell painting of the encounter between the Salish people at a place called Ross's Hole in the Bitterroot Valley, or what we know as Kutil Sule. It's a big gathering area is sort of roughly the translation. And it's in the upper Bitterroot. This, so what the elders have said is that that the scouts, so there was a camp, there was a camp of about 30 or more teepees, about 400 people, about 80 who were warriors who were there to protect the well-being of the people, and a very large number of horses. You can see that from this depiction, and then off on the side are these strangers and visitors. So the scouts had observed that there were visitors and strangers coming right into the heart of their territory. They didn't send an emissary ahead. There were no traditional norms of hospitality. They were just coming into our territory. The tribes gathered, the leaders gathered all of the leaders together, and the scouts said that it appears that that this was a very different group. Some of them were walking, some of them were on horseback. It appeared that it was possibly a war party, but it looked like that they had been defeated. Their hair was cut short. It appeared that they were in mourning, which is our tradition. When there's been a death in the family, that you cut your hair as part of the mourning process. They had short hair. As some elders have said, that they were very confused by some of the people because they looked like upside down face people. They had hair on the bottom of their face and very little on the top of their head. So they didn't know what, if they were, what kind of people they were, these upside down face people. Also, one of the people with them appeared to have blackened his face, one warrior, and that they thought that might be their spiritual leader. And they appeared to be cold and possibly ill. They were very pink and white, and
I think I heard that. The blind team, it was successful.
So there
was-
was a question about these people, and you can see that the elders then gathered together. There were some of the people that said we should kill them if they are ill. They present a threat to the well-being of our people, and there were others that said we are bound to traditional norms of hospitality. If they're ill, we'll care for them. We'll provide them food. We'll provide them better horses. Their horses do not look fit. We'll care for them. So that's all of that is what is told in this painting, and I just love it. It's one of my favorites. Tom, what more would you?
Well,
add to this?
I would offer, Germaine, that in some ways, Charlie Russell was kind of step one of pulling a dirty trick on all the Lewis and Clark fans out there. And that then we followed that up with an even dirtier trick with this book. I say that in jest but we kind of wonder if there are all kinds of Lewis and Clark fans out there who snap up this book and open it up and wonder, wait a minute, where's Lewis and Clark? They really aren't a big part of the book. Really, the book is more focused on the rich tribal cultural world they were entering. To kind of counter that idea, as Doug noted earlier, that they were somehow discoverers, that in fact they were just visitors to a place that had been a homeland for the Salish and Upper Kalispel people for thousands of years. And so Charlie Russell, in one of the great subversive artworks in Western Americana, was commissioned by the legislature soon after the turn of the century in Montana to create a gigantic mural to hang behind the dais of the Speaker of the House in Montana, as it does to this day. and, do Lewis and Clark. Great, and he came back with this. And you really wouldn't even know it has anything to do with Lewis and Clark. They're kind of these blurry, haggling figures in the background if you didn't know the title of the painting. What he puts front and center are the heroic, presence in the painting, are the Salish horsemen. And so, Russell shared some deep misgivings about what had transpired in the century preceding his own arrival in this part of the world, and felt deeply many of the critiques of what was universally called progress. Shared those critiques that he heard from many of his tribal friends. So, we just, in some ways, this book then, and you probably have noted this book is reproduced at the back of the volume, but I think thanks to the elders, we just carried that critique further. So next one, Germaine.
Una. Yes. So the tribes, there were a number of middle-aged tribal people in the early 70s who were deeply saddened by the fact that oftentimes grandparents only spoke our language. Parents were bilingual and children were English only speakers. And they carried a huge burden of responsibility of carrying our traditional language, our history, our culture, and they were carrying that burden for future generations. And there was a brilliant, there were a couple of brilliant middle-aged people, Clarence Woodcock, Johnny Arlee, Tony Inkashola, who were those in-between people. They had been raised in fluent speaking households. They spoke their language. They were noticing that their children, their nieces and nephews did not understand but a few words of our language. And they invited all of the elders to come together, and some brilliant person in that group, in the middle-aged group, turned on a recorder, and they recorded thousands of hours of oral history information. And it's like the Vatican treasury of the tribes. I mean, it's just astonishing. They talked about our history, our culture, our language, our family relationships. And these incredibly wise elders were the beginning of the Culture Committee, and are the foundation for this book, the foundation for the material that we drew from for this book.
Absolutely.
What else?
I think you said it, Germaine. Shall we go to the next one?
Yes. Yeah. So over the years, the elders have contributed greatly. Some of them are our relatives, some of them are our close friends. And these are the voices that we have listened to. And these are the extraordinarily wise people who have talked about what they heard from their elders and heard from their ancestors about a way of life that they knew before visitors and strangers came to this land. What else, Tom?
Well, just that, and I guess that these are the elders that Germaine was referring to, that really their recordings form the great bulk of what are in the oral history archives that we work with, and their vision, their understanding, their perspective on tribal history and culture and its meaning are what shaped this book and the other things that we're producing.
The knowledge of the land, the knowledge of the plant and animal communities was not just encyclopedic, it was also extraordinarily intimate. Shay.
Next one. Okay.
Yes. Coyote. This is a wonderful time. There's snow on the ground. So this is a time when we begin to bring out coyote stories. And coyote stories are hugely important. Not only are they delightful, and we wait for this time of year when we can say, tell us coyote stories. They're so important. But these stories, these coyote stories, are stories that that have been told for tens of thousands of years, that explain our relationship with the natural world and our place in the world and our reliance on the plant and animal communities for our well-being. What else, Tom?
Well, yeah, those stories do form the foundation of tribal culture in so many respects, and the relationships with the plants and animals in the lands and waters. And I think, as the next slide shows, they also describe something else.
Let's go there. Oh, yes, yes. The coyote stories talk about a time when there was a battle between hot and cold, and a time when there was an incredibly cold time. And it's so like the narrative of glacial Lake Missoula. These stories are incredibly important and talk about our relationship with this place. More, Tom?
Yes, well, I guess just to tag on to that, we realize when we go through the coyote stories are so many things. They're the spiritual foundation. They form the foundation of kind of the cultural sense of right and wrong. But they also are something else. And that's described in the book in that one section, that they describe a strange and now vanished world, covered in snow and ice, one in which much larger versions of the animals that we know today existed. And the battles between the forces, the spiritual forces of warm and cold, until there arrived the seasonal climate regime that we know today. And we realize in going through these things and their uncanny parallels, not just with what happened, but where, that they are in part also a kind of mythologized memory of distant reaches of tribal history, that they are testimony to how long the tribes have been here. And that's really mind-boggling. And I think it leads well to the next slide, Germaine.
Yeah, I'm anxious to get to Q&A. I see that there's some questions already up, so let's move. Let's move. Okay. Oh, this is a wonderful slide. I love this slide. As Doug said, oftentimes we're taught in school about the Lewis and Clark expedition, and that's really the time that most people believe that history begins in this place. And yet what we know as people who have been here for tens of thousands of years, that myth is not accurate. Tom, something more.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when this is a prettier version of the same graphic that appears in the book. And you know, it's a graphic representation of really the main point of the book. That if we have to boil it down into one sentence, it's no, history didn't begin in 1805. And to the contrary, even if we conservatively take just the last 10,000 years of this time scale on this graphic, Lewis and we boil all that 10,000 years into one 24-hour day beginning at midnight and ending at midnight, Lewis and Clark wouldn't arrive until 11:30 p.m. So it's hardly the start of the day. And I would just note a couple other things. One is that the oldest known, and this is public information, I'm not revealing anything, it's been in National Geographic and other things, but the oldest known human remains that have been found within Séliš-Ql Aboriginal territories along a place called Flathead Creek, which is a tributary of the Shield River, date to about 12,800 years ago. In other words, just after the last draining of glacial Lake Missoula. So that 10,000 years truly is conservative. And to put that into context, the oldest of the pyramids in Egypt are about 6,000 years old. So it's a really long time to live in one place. Does that sound right,
Great.
Jermaine?
Yes, yes, thank you, Tom.
Okay, next.
Next, please, yes. Oh, this is a wonderful gathering of tribal leaders and elders in Séliš-Ql. This is a reminder of how important it is to come together and share information, share time as in community. This is a wonderful picture of celebration. Tom, what else would you say about this?
I would add, Germaine, that one of the things that we try to get across in the book is that you can't understand the world that Lewis and Clark were passing through without understanding some aspects of tribalism and of the tribal mode of subsistence and the tribal form of social organization. And, you know, obviously in a minute, in our little intro here, we can't go into any depth with that, but it was and it is a very different way of being in the world than the dominant society. It's a culture and a way of life and an economic system that isn't ordered by competitive individual self-interest, but by as Germaine, that spirit of coming together, of serving the generations to come, and of people acting out of a sense of the well-being of the whole.
That life of reciprocity and respect and
Yes.
and collaboration, that sense of community that we and a great sense of humility that you know, we rely on the plants and animals. They were here first. You know, we don't live long without air, without water, without food. You know, we understand that. That's hugely important. And we come together and celebrate that. After we begin our first food ceremony, you know, it's part of the seasonal cycle of life. And I think we're going to talk more about that in the next slide, right, Tom?
Yes, there you go.
So have we identified this woman, Tom?
No, there's confusion around it. So
Yeah.
we just have to say she's Salish, and we're not sure. Yeah.
Yes. And this is an incredibly important part of our first food ceremony. Bitter is a hugely important first food. It is nutritious, it's delicious. I remember when I was a little girl, my dad would say, "Eat this, it's good for you." And I'd say, "Oh, it's so bitter." And he'd put berries with it for me. And I remember thinking, this is really good food and I should eat this. And my dad said, "It's really good to eat and I'll eat it." And then when my girls were little, I'd say, "Eat this, it's really good for you." And they'd say, "Mom, it's really bitter." And I'd put some berries in it. And, you know, it is wonderful, good food. And this tradition of gathering and peeling bitter roots is part of our first food ceremony. And it's part of that celebrating the spring and first food. And we have a root feast that begins our seasonal cycle in the spring. And then in the summer, we gather and we celebrate and we share. And there's a time of intertribal exchange and gifting. In the fall, oftentimes we hunt, and in the winter we tell stories. Anything else, Tom?
Well, yeah.
One of the important things about this is that that was then, this is now. We continue this tradition. This is a tradition that remains important for us to this day. We continue to have our first food ceremony, and we continue to gather together and harvest bitterroot in a sustainable way. And that continuity of culture, I think, is really important. There's a sense that I think there's a sense that that we learn from Be Westerns, that Indigenous people are either dead, or they're remnants of a once noble culture, or they're heathen savages. That's sort of the portrayal of Indigenous people, and really there's very little sense of the continuity of culture over time, and that's a wonderful picture that talks about that continuity of culture over time.
Yes.
Anything else about that, Tom?
Well, I mean, to lead into the map of Aboriginal territories, I would perhaps just tag on there, Germaine, that bitterroot are just, that's one part of this complex, very precise, very disciplined, deeply knowledgeable mode of subsistence that was completely non-agricultural, completely just about gathering plant foods, hunting and fishing. And yeah,
I'm sorry, can I add to this?
Yes.
Because we lived at the backbone of the world where the water began, we were plateau people in that we have winter ceremonies. We were plains people in that we hunted bison. But because we lived in such an incredibly ecologically rich environment, we also had access to bull trout. And because of that, we had the ability to deal with abundance and scarcity. So when there was an abundance of bison or an abundance of roots and we were successful as hunters, there was an abundance. But when there was scarcity, there was always a high quality source of protein, and that was in bull trout. So we were incredibly wealthy in that.
Yes. So, I mean, maybe we should stop soon, Germaine, just to
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes.
One thing I would maybe just add about the map is that this, of course, refers in a sense to the place name segment of the Lewis and Clark book, the Salish People book. It's what we usually call it. And as you know, every book, every movie, every anything about Lewis and Clark that's out there has a map of Lewis and Clark's trail. And one of the many ways we drive home the point that history didn't begin in 1805 is to point out that they were following very old tribal trails. And so we take readers on a journey of the route they took, but in the opposite direction, just to drive the point home a little bit more, and showing the very ancient, actually a mix of place names, some ancient and some not, but many of them tied right back to the coyote stories that began this little thing. And should we just like go to discussion from there, Germaine?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I thank you guys. Thank you very much for going to the time and putting that together for us. And we already have some great questions in the chat, so I'm going to hand that over to Jill here in just a second. The place names discussion is one also, Germaine, that's very current for us, right? That this is not just an academic discussion, but it is one that we brought up on our board meeting with the superintendent, outgoing superintendent Mao, the acting superintendent from Denver, Kate Hammond, and the deputy, that we're really actively through the tribal relations working group that you co-chair with Cheryl Cobell Zwang, who's Blackfeet. This is we're trying to make this more than just an academic discussion. And people might be interested in hearing kind of where we're headed a little bit on that at the Conservancy.
Absolutely. That's so exciting. The wonderful thing about place names is that these are ancient names. These are names that sometimes come from coyote stories that talk about resources, about landforms, about I mean, just in a world that was deeply known and understood for tens of thousands of years. And those place names really tell us about a changing world. You know, and there are Salish place names and Blackfeet place names in the park and Kootenai place names in the park. And we want to share those with the visiting public to help inform them about how we see the park. And place names are so profoundly important because they're that window into a much deeper time. So they cover tens of thousands of years of relationship with a particular place. We think that that's important to share.
Yeah, and we could use encouragement from others as you visit the park and visit with rangers. You know, the park leadership has been like, yeah, sure, we're in. But it also takes some support perhaps from, hey, here's a sign. What are the native place names here? So curiosity is also a good thing. So you might help us out on that. Joe, we've got some great questions.
We do, and we have a new facilitator in town. It's our very own Thompson Smith, because he's been jumping in the chat and answering some questions too, which has been great. So
we'll probably make him repeat some of those because there are some of us who are not very techie. So
yeah, for sure. And I want to touch base for folks who might not have been able to join and they're watching the recording back. So yeah, thanks Thompson for having that record in there too. That's nice to reference. There was a little interesting back and forth at the beginning of the presentation about oral histories. Mm-hmm. And Tom, you put a really great comment in the chat, but could you kind of expand on that and just give the group a little more context?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, as we address in the introduction to the book, oral histories have long not been given serious attention by very many historians. And that's certainly true in a lot of the Lewis and Clark material out there, and generally regarded as kind of unreliable, like the telephone game or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's generally been a very crude, unsophisticated engagement with oral tradition and not recognizing, you know, to kind of look at the source as you would with a written document. You know, if a written document was written by somebody, and I won't name any names here, but somebody regarded as wholly untrustworthy and just full of crap, you're not going to regard that piece of paper very seriously, except as a document of that. And oral traditions, you know, need the same or greater care and attention, but they also need respect. And the thing is you cannot get at tribal perspectives on our history unless you do engage with oral tradition. And Germaine, maybe you can add on to some of this, but my sense from the elders, and this is really talked about in the introduction as well, is that when oral tradition is transmitted within a context of kind of cultural responsibility and rigor, its reliability is actually kind of astonishing. So the example we point to in the introduction are coyote stories, the same coyote story written down by Jesuit missionaries in the 1840s and then recorded by the Culture Committee with an elder or elders in the 1970s, virtually verbatim, unchanged across the most traumatic period of tribal history and cultural loss. So if it's reliable across that time period, you know, it's just it was a good reflection of one of the many reasons we need to take it seriously. So Germaine, hand it back to you.
So we look forward to coyote stories and we listen attentively. Our culture is really based on two great pillars. One is a relationship with the plant and animal world, with the natural world, and the other is a relationship with each other. And that relationship of respect with each other in community means that when an elder honors us by sharing information, we listen attentively, and we listen attentively year after year after year. And we, you know, I mean, I remember hearing coyote stories with just, I would, you know, I would say, stem us, meet me, you know, tell me a story. And I was so excited to hear coyote stories, and I would hear them year after year after year. And it was just something that we looked forward to with great delight. And hearing them year after year after year, we, you know, those go deep into our memory. Those go, you know, it's as if they're crystallized in amber because we hear them winter after winter after winter. So I believe that reliability is just impeccable.
And that tradition to share the coyote stories, particularly in winter, Susan was wondering, is that the reason we read this book in the winter? Doug, I'm not sure. Was that just coincidence that we chose this date for this book, or was that intentional? You're also on mute.
Intentional,
Doug.
Right, Doug?
Yeah,
That
I
was
would like to say,
intentional.
that it was intentional, but I think it's a better lucky than good offering there.
It was intentional.
Yes. And the elders tell us that it's important to say those things that are appropriate at a particular time of the year. I mean, if we live in a way that is that follows seasonal rounds, you know, we harvest the bitterroot when the bitterroot is ready after we have the first root feast. We, you know, we harvest camas when the camas root is ready. And the elders say that there is a time that we bring the stories out in the winter when there's snow on the ground, and we put them away in the spring when the thunder wakes the hibernating animals. So our time is prescribed, and we honor that.
Jermaine.
Yeah. And I would just, yeah, just to add on to that, Jermaine, that was so eloquently said. And you know, one thing is that all through the summer months, warmer, not, you know, when it's not winter, people are traveling through these places that refer directly back to the stories. You know, so they go to the bottom of Evero Hill, where you come out of the monster's anus, a place called Séliš-Ql, which means place where you come out into the open, or, you know, across the Clark Fork to Amtkana, something sitting on the edge, or down to Lolo, Thompson, no salmon, all of which refer to cow stories. Yeah. And, you know, no doubt the kids traveling with their parents and grandparents are saying, how come it's called Thompson, Dad? And it's like, wait till winter, we'll tell you then. And then those long winter nights, you know, you're in those lodges for many, many hours. There's some entertainment too that's been kind of you know, set aside for that special time of year. That's what the elders tell us anyway, Jermaine.
Una, yes.
And at what point does someone become an elder? Germaine or Tom, both of you could chime in. Gina's wondering, is it at a certain age, or is it someone who's known for their wisdom and stories?
Being an elder is an honorific title, and it has really nothing to do with age. There are some elders who were raised in families where they were leaders of ceremonial life, or they were culture bearers, and they have a tremendous burden of responsibility to carry forward history, culture, geography, all of the information that's important for future generations. And so it's really an honorific title. There are some people that are quite young that are considered to be elders because of their incredible knowledge and their wisdom. especially wisdom, not just knowledge, but wisdom as well. Tom, you work with elders currently. What would you add to that?
I think you just said it perfectly, and it's been kind of a self-selecting group over time, and this is one thing I guess I would note is that when the Tribal Council, which is the governing body of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, established culture committees, a Kootenai culture committee and a Salish Pondere or Séliš-Ql culture committee, two separate unrelated languages. So there had to be two culture committees. When they did this in the mid-70s, they also were in effect restoring elders to their traditional role in tribal governance as advisors to the chiefs, which they've always been for thousands of years, as the elders have told us. And it helped guide the overall direction of the tribe since that time. And it's only been since that time that tribal governance really has kind of rebuilt its capacity. Back in the mid-70s, when the culture committees were formed, there were a handful of tribal employees. Now there are something like 12 or 1,300. So it's been during that time that the Natural Resource Department, all these programs, social services that really have tribal cultural values at their heart. So I like to think that in some sense, maybe just an indirect overall sense, that the elders' cultural vision has helped guide and direct the development of tribal government, or the redevelopment of tribal government.
Yeah, that's great. Janet asked, do you know if the book has been adopted as required reading in any schools or college class curriculums? And Tom, you jumped in the chat and said that it is actually at many classes at different levels. Could you elaborate on that a little bit for the group?
Yeah, I mean, Germaine, maybe you know more about how or where it's used than I do. I just, I've had the great pleasure of making contact with an Indigenous scholar named Lisa Brooks, who's done some of the best work there is out there that really incorporates place names into the telling of history. Her work is about her people in what's now New England, and the Wampanoag and other people in that part of the world. But I know it's used in other classes, and unless I don't have kids, unfortunately. I wish I did, but so I don't know what's happening in the schools around here. Germaine, do you? High schools or junior high?
I think that Office of Public Instruction has, has state standards for science, for geography, and there is also in Montana Indian Education for All. So it's a law that they teach cross-cultural materials. So many of the work, many of the materials that the tribes have produced have been integrated into Montana schools, particularly in libraries, but are available for schools in Montana.
That's great. And Tom also left a really great link in the chat for those of you that haven't seen it yet. And if you're interested in the place names listed in the book and you'd like to hear the language kind of firsthand, Tom left that really great link in the chat. So you can just hear the voices of the elders and kind of just get some more context there. So thanks for sharing that, Tom.
Oh, you're welcome.
Kathy is wondering if you could talk a bit about the artwork by Corky Claremont that's shown in the book.
Germaine, do you want to say anything about Corky's stuff?
Oh, he's great. I think that you worked with him more closely on this. Why don't you start off, Tom?
Well, Corky's an amazing artist and an amazingly productive artist. He's now retired. He was the founder of the art program at Séliš-Ql College, one of the best tribal colleges in the nation. And he's a tribal member here. And it's one of the it might be the only part of the book that I kind of got in there somehow that my boss, the director of the culture committee, Tony Inkashola, really doesn't like very much. Corky's art just doesn't ring a bell with Tony, but I love it. And much of Corky's art is very pointed. He did a whole series that was a powerful critique of the tar sands in Canada. He's done a bunch of stuff related to water. He did an amazing piece recently related to COVID that kind of refers in a way back to smallpox and this indigenous people surviving previous pandemics. But yeah, Corky was just typically generous. He was already working on this. It's actually a huge series on the Bicentennial, a series of multimedia art pieces. And he was just like, yeah, use whichever ones you want. That's Corky. Just an incredibly generous person. And his wife, Linda King, one of the most accomplished beaters and kind of artisans in the tribal community here.
That's awesome. It's incredible to think about. And to kind of tie this back to the Russell painting, right? I've never known the backstory until this book of a painting that my office was directly underneath that painting for a number of years, right? And so Russell was also kind of a character, right? And had his place in APCAR. When I look at that 1906 photograph of people together, that's maybe 10 years before Nancy and Charlie started being present in the park physically. So it's interesting to see how artists can have that kind of power, right? To connect with us in a way that feels non-threatening, but can, as you point out, Germaine, be very challenging.
And I think that one of the interesting things about this is that the elders really like Charlie Russell art because he got it right. He got the details right. Our traditional style of footwear was a side seam moccasin. And when he was painting Salish People, he painted Salish side seam moccasin. And and so the details were right, the colors were right, the designs were right, the styles of footwear and the styles of cradle boards or all of the pieces. I mean, he saw the details of our life and he recreated that with incredible clarity and precision. There are a lot of people that there are different views about Charlie Russell's art, but that piece of the art I really appreciate.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, speaking of appreciation, we've come to, pardon me, the end of our time together. This is an hour that has gone so incredibly quickly because the content has been so enriching. Germaine White, Thompson Smith, thank you so much. We will be back at it next month in January with Matthew Dickerson and his newest book. Grace, you're going to have to help me with the title,
A Fine Spotted Trout on Coral Creek.
Very good. Matthew Dickerson as a professor at Middlebury College and wrote this book while the artist of residence in Glacier National Park. We are giving one away, and I know Randy Gray, I know you're the one sitting there, but Nora is the winner of the book this month. So please don't open it. It will come to her. You can read it second. And so thanks again to everybody for a fabulous evening. Julie and I and all of us at the Conservancy wish for all of you a holiday season that is safe and filled with family and blessings and a new year filled, we hope, for you and yours with healing and renewal. Thank you all for being a part of our family, our Glacier family. And we look forward to brighter days ahead as we continue to live, learn, laugh, and love. Thanks again, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thanks, Germaine. Thanks, Tom.
Thank
That went
you.
so fast.
Yeah.
I know. I'm kind of astonished.
I feel like
That
we could
was-
go forever.
Grace, you want to hit the recording piece, then we can